Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Season 5, Episode 13 of Cap and Gown. I'm Rachel Phillips-Buck, VP for Student Success at Ferris Resources, joined this afternoon by Matt Boisvert, our president. Hey, Matt.
Hi, Rachel. Hey, it's February.
It is February, and do you remember in the rhythm of the academic year that this is the hardest month? Thank goodness it's short. Would you like to know all the reasons why it's the hardest month?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Everyone's going to get the flu.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to get sick of their roommate. The shine of a new start, which was January's theme, is starting to wear off as students are getting their first test results back. And they're like, dang, I haven't done as well as I thought. Also, Valentine's Day is here, which causes difficulty. And we are not yet in the season of spring break excitement. So it's just cold and dark in a lot of places and the hardest month. So how's that for some encouraging news?
Well, I'm really, I know that's true. My son came over yesterday and talking about how everyone's sick. But also my middle child spent this weekend, left her university and came and spent the weekend with my youngest daughter while I was out of town and had a great time there. And it's like, I think she's just getting primed for February,
Yeah. It's a little bit tricky. Yeah. Well, I want to remind everybody that our theme of the year, we've just come off our curiosity theme. We've moved into our intentionality theme. So just being intentional in what we do. And I want to talk about that a little bit at the top of our episode. Matt, you have a good example of that for us. But here's my housekeeping. The next time we do Cap and Gown will be February 18th. We are doing a deep dive into Slow Productivity by Cal Newport, which is our book for the year. I've only read the first 2 chapters, and I can't tell you how many times things that he's said in those chapters have come up since I read it. They've come up in my classes. They've come up in my personal life, just thinking about slow productivity and what that means. So that's going to be really fun to dive into. Rachel Elam was saying she's so interested in the topic, she got the book. So she's like, I'm not just going to listen to your summary of it. I'm actually going to dive in and read the book. So that's super fun. And then we have a webinar tomorrow around a brand new feature that we built in Ferris 360 called Workflow that is created to help you with your registration, non-registration processes. I don't even want to talk about it yet, but you guys were there already, right? February is when we start getting our account holds taken off and all of that kind of stuff and thinking about getting our students registered for the fall. So if you're interested in how that brand new tool is going to help you in that process, please join us tomorrow. Okay. So our theme is intentionality, and we are talking specifically, Matt, I told you, as we are like framing this idea of intentionality, I think what's helpful is to think about it as like thinking one level higher than where you're acting, right? So it's like you're doing this thing, and intentionality is like, put a pause on that. Think about why you're doing this thing. Where does it fall in priority? How important is it? How are you going to do it intentionally? And then go back and do that thing. And I just think that's a great way of framing that for our listeners. I was laughing because when we told Viva, our director of RI, that we were thinking about intentionality as our theme, she's like, Rachel, you guys say that all the time. And I was like, we do say that all the time because we're constantly trying to tell our team, like, hey, you have to be thoughtful about what you're asking people to do, about what you're building, about processes. We don't want to do things willy-nilly. We want to be very intentional about it. So I think that that's a super helpful theme for our listeners this year, for me too.
Yeah. And when I think about, like, for instance, you doing something willy-nilly instead of being intentional, I just can't even imagine what that would look like. That's just wasting time. And so
my least favorite. Yeah. In fact, I met with the school the other day, and they were telling me this kind of willy-nilly process that they had. And I was like, you guys, and they were like, surely there's a better way. And I said, if you are ever doing anything in our system and you're like, this is crazy, there's like unnecessary steps and it doesn't make sense, please come and talk to me, because I can't stand that kind of stuff. So either I'm like, listen, we have a process for that, let me show you, or we're going to fix it, because willy-nilly does not do it for me.
Yeah. So okay. I want to tell you about someone who was never willy-nilly. So what I'm gonna try and do is bring stories of people we know, like celebrities or so famous people, and some specific ways that they were intentional. And so this morning I was trying to think like who's the first character, and in this case it truly is a character, but I know that it's someone you love and have loved introducing to your daughter. And so I'm going to talk about Lucille Ball.
Oh,
Actually, I expect you'll have a lot to say about her. So,
okay.
but talk about someone who was not willy-nilly, like super intentional. And I like that contrast, right? Like the if you imagine Lucille Ball, the these are things, everything she did had purpose. It seems like, right? So CBS approached her and wanted to put on My Favorite Husband as a TV show, and she was like, "Okay, well, if we're going to do a show, it's going to be I Love Lucy. I'm going to have my real husband. He's going to be acting with me." And everyone was like, "No," for a lot of reasons, right? Like
Yeah.
Cuban American, or I guess Cuban immigrant, and no, we don't want to have him. They put their own money in to create a vaudeville act so that they could prove their chemistry to CBS. Like at the time, it was $5,000, like not cheap.
Yeah.
They formed their own production company. They chose to film in Hollywood, not New York. Then they hired this cinematographer who had a 3 camera system, which was totally new.
Remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. So very intentional just in the setup of how you're going to cast us, and what this is going to be
And they
about.
had their own production company, right?
Right.
So they're like,
Yeah.
I mean, the reason they made so much money is because they were like, we're going to have our production company and we're going to hold the originals.
This is a really good example. So when you think about um, a thing like pay, so they agreed or decided or put forward, we'll accept, you'll pay us $1,000 less, but we get all the rights to this show.
Yeah.
And they were the ones who created the rerun. So I mean, you think about like how long I Love Lucy has been on
I mean,
TV.
it's still on.
Yeah. So they chose to film on 35 millimeter instead of the cheaper quality film so that it would be long lasting. And they required filming in front of a live audience, which,
Mm,
I mean, that still holds.
yeah.
Like, okay, so there's a lot of other things I could go into, but I
Yeah.
don't know.
It's a
Is there?
great example of at every step of the way, instead of just saying this is what we've always done, being like, but what if we, right? But I'm going to do it in this different way. And when
Yeah.
you do that, you create a lot of value. So it's not that you've just stumbled upon all of this stuff. It's that you're thinking about how do we create value in what we're doing. And things like we're going to produce a TV show, that one level higher is like, hold on though. How are we going to do that? Who's going to own it? Right? What's the film? What are the rights that we're going to have? Intentional about what you're building, which I really love. And Matt, I like it because a lot of times we talk to people in higher education who feel a little bit powerless about their jobs, right? Like I can't control what happens or the expectations, but you can control what you do every day and you can be really intentional about it. So
Yeah.
it's a great example.
Lucille Ball.
Lucille Ball, she is a wonder. Her chocolate
Also,
episode, the episode of her at the Chocolate Factory is just one of the best moments in television ever. So,
I
all
think
right.
it would be a great meme today. Like, it seems like that there's a lot of great ways that you could use that as your social media meme.
Her and the
The
Chocolate
other,
Factory.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that she's a huge reason why Star Trek happened.
Why?
Well, she started a company to she became head of a major studio. She was the one who supported the Star Trek being a TV show,
Huh.
invested in that. She reviewed the expensive pilot. After other executives wanted to reject it, she overruled her board of directors to approve the second pilot. She allocated additional budget for special effects. She protected the show from network interference. She created a separate budget category for specifically innovative programming. And think about like Star Trek. So thank
Thanks,
you, Lucille
Lucille.
Ball.
Appreciate you. You're a gift.
There you go. Intentionality.
intentionality. All right, that brings us to the State of the Union. Okay, Matt, State of the Union. So, first of all, last time we met, we had all of these funding, we had this funding freeze in place. So, everyone was like, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything right now because it's been paused by a judge, but people are waiting to see kind of what happens with that. Also, remember that we're trying to understand better what's going to happen with accreditation because there's been a lot of talk around that since Trump got elected. So there's just like a lot of things up in the air around higher education. I think I told you this morning that there was another Dear Colleague letter. Sorry, Bailey's going to be mad at me because I'm skipping around, but there's another Dear Colleague letter that came from Craig Traynor, who's the acting assistant secretary for civil rights, who is talking about now Title IX is going to be ruled by 2020 rules, not the latest rules that Biden passed. So that's pretty interesting. The letter says any open Title IX investigations initiated under the 2024 Title IX rules should be immediately reevaluated to comply with the requirement of the 2020 rule. So in some ways, it's helpful because we have a lot of schools who have operated under that rule before this new one came into place. So they kind of understand the regulations and requirements of that. But it's that you want to talk about willy-nilly back and forth, right?
It's very hard to be intentional when it changes in almost every year. I mean, especially every 4 years or administration changes, but there's been a lot of changes in Title IX since really 2000 and I don't know, 2008, 2010. So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, another thing that's really interesting. You remember we talked about how there was this data, what is it, the Student Clearinghouse data, and they made a mistake and said, like, never mind. We thought enrollment was lower. Yeah, but actually it's increased 5%. Well, based on that data, there was some guesses that the FAFSA budget was going to be okay because they're like, oh, we have way fewer people who have applied. It's because of the botched rollout, so we're fine. The news today is that the Pell Grant program has a $2.7 billion shortfall heading into this fiscal year. This is terrible. They thought that in June, they said it's going to have an $11 billion surplus because this assumption was based on the decline of applications. And in actuality, they're going to have a deficit. So just trying to figure out, like, what are they going to do if program funding is not shored up? Students could face eligibility or funding cuts for the first time in a decade. The consensus is that's not going to happen, that they're going to address it and figure out what to do. But really hard to plan when you don't know about enrollment and you don't know about the budget, right?
So I think that's exactly what we were talking about 2 weeks ago, right? Or last week about it. Like, can we believe anything? Can we believe these numbers? How do you plan? And remember, I was like, how many people went into their board of trustees meeting and were like, well, hey, it's not just us, it's these other schools, but they were wrong. And so when you're trying to make strategic or intentional decisions there, it's super hard when the numbers are wrong.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of an avalanche, right? Where it's like this assumption proves to be wrong. And then you made this assumption and this assumption. And I mean, what's helpful about it is with intentionality, it gives you a moment to be like, let's pause and really figure out what's true and readjust. We don't want to say, like, we started on this course and now we're here and what are we going to do? There are things you can do to adjust to changing data. So,
but I have great confidence that Pell is going to be funded. There's a lot of bipartisan support for that. So
yeah, for sure. Okay. Also, State of the Union, we're always talking about the NCAA. Well, they and 4 states plus the District of Columbia have settled a lawsuit over the association's rule prohibiting the use of name, image, and likeness compensation in the recruitment of athletes. Okay. So it's Tennessee, Virginia, Florida, New York, and the District of Columbia. argued that the NCAA's NIL recruiting ban violated antitrust laws by restricting the ability of athletes to benefit commercially from NIL deals. This is the policy the NCAA has that says NIL deals with collective or boosters cannot be part of the recruitment package. So they can't talk about that before they commit to a college, which is really interesting. The judge of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Tennessee said, nope, we're not going to do that. I'm going to put an injunction on that. This outcome means that there's some question now about the NCAA's authority over college athletics, and could pave the way for a judge to approve the settlement in the House versus NCAA antitrust litigation. If that happens, Matt, the NCAA will have to pay $2.8 billion in back pay for the use of athletes' NIL since 2016, and create a revenue sharing model which participating colleges would distribute a fifth of their annual revenue to their players. So, for most of our smaller colleges, this is not a thing, right? Because they're not making big money on this, but it is really interesting. We've been talking about this for 2 years, maybe almost 3 years, the evolution of how we think about athletes on our campuses. Pretty interesting. Okay, I'm just going to let you think about that. Okay. I have 3 more exciting stories for you. These are the ones that I love. First of all, there's a great article in Inside Higher Ed about 4 ways to develop on-campus student workers. I would really encourage a full read of this. They're like, if you want to have on-campus workers, you've got to embed that. You have to be intentional. It's not just work study. It's how do we use this to better our college students' experiences, right? So they're like, number 1, offer credit. You can do like a 1-hour elective along with student worker positions where you have kind of experiential learning opportunities, incorporating metacognition, which is a nice way of saying intentionality, into your jobs, and a reflection on the experience. So how do we give them college credit for working on campus? Number 2, create intentional supervisor-employer conversations, which you and I have been talking about forever. This comes out of the University of Iowa Grow, which our school Schreiner Grow, where they're saying employee supervisors, if you want to have a work study position in your office, you have to promise twice a semester to sit down with your student employee and say, what have you learned? What skills are you developing? How is this going to help you in the larger area of work, right? So you've learned how to schedule, you've learned conflict resolution, you've learned all of those things, to lay that out and have them articulate that so they can use it for their resume, which we love.
Yeah. How does it align with your major?
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Break down silos in employment support, which I know is going to make you crazy, because their example is in Ithaca College, they put their student employment office into the Center for Career Exploration and Development, much like you did at ACU 15 years ago, to say like, hey, if we're going to be in charge of jobs and career, we want to have all of those things so that we can make that really cohesive, and we can talk to students about all of the elements of how this is going to help you prepare for your future endeavors, right? And then recognize students' excellence, which is how do we look at student worker positions and create an award to say you've done a great job in showing responsibility and showing self-agency, whatever that looks like on your campus, to be able to support that. So I love that. Again, just like being very, very intentional about how you use student work, which is great. All right. This article coming out of Inside Higher Ed, as well as about first-generation students on campus, I'm just going to summarize this by saying we know that the support that we give for our athletes on a campus, where you have dedicated tutors and you have people who are like, we're going to help you enroll, and we're going to help you get your financial aid worked out, and we're going to help you, like all of the stuff that we do for athletes, we know that that model works for other populations on our campus. So Matt, you and I have been talking for a long time about how to do that for our commuters, have a space where commuters can go and microwave their lunch and take a rest between classes and print their papers, right? But this article about the University of South Carolina, they're doing that for first generation students. And they're saying when you provide a space for a population on your campus, you give them a sense of belonging. So they've tied this into their learning communities, and they've just said, here's the space where you have faculty advisors, where we're doing all of your, like, any questions you have about financial aid, this is the space where you're going to do that. And it's really having an effect on that population of student success. So I think the ability to replicate that for all of your student populations is genius. It's just, how do you afford it? Right.
Yeah, you start with one population and you bring success there,
Yeah.
and that increase in retention for that population helps you fund the next population and
So
get buy-in from leadership, right?
that's right. And I think the thing is, you have to cast the vision for how that's going to snowball. So I think when you ask for the funds to do it in a small population, you say exactly what you've just said, which is, and when we increase retention, here's how much we need to be able to do it again and increase retention and do it again and do it again and do it again. And we've seen that happen on campuses, right? Where they say, if you'll give me 3 more success coaches, I think I can increase retention this amount. And then you're going to give me a 4th, and then you're going to give me a 5th, and then you're going to give me a 6th. So,
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about our friend Brian Dawson and how he did that with his national parks group, and how you can replicate that then. In his case, he took a res hall that no one wanted to live in, and it was kind of, abandoned, and made it a thriving community. Really
yeah.
neat.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, the last one I have, I'm going to skip one because it's a rebuttal to our citizens article or client article about how students are clients. I'm going to skip it because I think we can talk too long about it, and I want to make sure we get to our guest. So,
Okay.
but we'll talk about it next time, I promise, because it's a good one. The last one, the one I want to close with, is this phone app coming out of Dartmouth, which is called Mood Capture, which was created to kind of identify depression in students using their phone unlock, like a picture of their face, right? So these students did all of these tests where they were asking students to, when they unlocked their phone, they were asking them to answer the question, I have felt down, depressed, or hopeless. Okay, so that's how it started. And then they put it all into AI, and they were like, look at what the students are saying and look at their face. This now app is able to predict depression early, up to 75% accurate, which is really amazing. In the picture, they're not only looking at what the person looks like, but they're also looking at things like, how dark is it when they take the picture? What's the location? How many people are in the picture when they're unlocking their screen? So the idea here is that when you do that, all of those photos live on the person's phone. That then the app is like, maybe you should go outside in the sunshine today. Maybe you should call your friend John. Not necessarily being like, it seems like you're depressed, but actually saying more like, these are suggestions for how to lighten your mood, which I think is a great application of AI.
I like that, Rachel. I'm curious about, so there's the informing the individual, but I wonder if there's a, I don't know, how could you do that where it's not just interacting with you, where I give permission, like if I'm having a really down day, that
Yeah,
someone who loves me would be, if I let them.
I would never do that. I really wouldn't. I don't want anyone to know my business. Send a note to my mom. Rachel's feeling sad today. Will you call her? No. We'll have to think about it. Surely there's some.
It doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to, just like
call Rachel and tell her to go outside.
Yeah.
She's feeling a little down.
I'm just saying, how do you personalize the nudge, right?
Yeah, for sure. How do we make it less about AI, Susie AI telling me to do it, and more about my community that cares about me?
It's a challenge, right? So there's like we can learn this thing, but then what's the appropriate response?
Yeah, for sure.
Relational
All right.
response.
Well, that is the State of the Union, which means I'm very excited because now I get to welcome our guest, Shara Hayes, on. She right now is the Dean of Student Care and Operations at George Fox University. Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm just so thrilled that you agreed to join us. I always say, especially like you have other things to do. So thank you. You're just sitting around. I know how it goes this time of year. Nothing really interesting happening. Okay, I have a lot of questions for you, but as I was doing research for this episode, I stumbled across your photography. Ma'am, you are an artist. These pictures are gorgeous. Bailey's going to pop some up. Rachel Elam, I wanted to make sure you saw this one. Rachel and I are lovers of fall. So when I saw this picture, I was like, that's incredible. These are gorgeous.
Thank you.
So I'm going to encourage everyone to follow you on Instagram.
Please do.
It's shara.hayes.photography. Is that right? See it up there? Okay, perfect. How did you start taking such beautiful pictures?
I actually started in college, so it was one of my elective classes and something that I enjoyed. And then I kind of fell off in doing it. And then once I finished my dissertation, I want to kind of fill my time with something else. And photography causes me to like slow down. It's very different than everything I do all the time. So I get out in nature, I slow down, I see the little things that are happening. So it's a good like stress reliever for me.
Yeah.
And so
when you did it in college, were you doing it with film? Like, is that actual film or is that digital?
No, that's digital, but I did it with film in college.
Yeah, I did too. And we did like go to the dark room, develop your film and all of that stuff. And it's that like using a manual camera is such an there's just so many pieces about how long the lens is open, right? And all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think here's my compliment to you. A lot of people take a lot of pictures, like there are images everywhere, but those are so artistic and beautiful. So I spent like 35 minutes stalking that Instagram page because they're so amazing. And if you guys are joining us just on podcast, you need to go look them up because they are beautiful. And it doesn't hurt that you live in a beautiful place.
No, it makes it much easier.
There's a lot of beauty going on. All right. So my first question for you, you've worked in the space of higher education in so many different avenues over the last 20, 25 years.
Yep.
Lots of different institutions from very big to very small. I'm really curious for you to give our listeners your reflections just on how this idea of student affairs and student development has evolved over the time that you've been in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen it change a lot over the years, especially just the student population. So, every 4 years, you're kind of cycling through students and what that looks like. And how we help a student looks very different than when I started my career as an RD at Baylor to where I am now in my career. And so really having to be innovative and being willing to change with the times, change with the students, change with their families and what that looks like and how that's happening. And so that evolvement kind of happens with their well-being, from how they handle academics to, like you were talking about, AI, like how do we involve each of those pieces and stuff. So I've really seen that kind of change over the last 20 plus years. And the way I approach something as an RD is very different than how I would approach it now as in my dean role and what that looks like, just because the student has changed, the families have changed, and even institutions have changed. And so how do we navigate on all of those evolving moments and what it looks like?
As you're saying that, it just makes me think about, there's always the joke about the faculty member who's done the same lectures for the last 35 years, right? And I think in some ways in student affairs and student development, you're almost forced to confront your student population in a way that maybe faculty aren't, because it's so interactive and it's so much about like this space outside of the classroom. And so I really think student affairs and student development has a platform to be able to teach faculty about who their students are, because I think a lot of times faculty can be very myopic in focusing on their subject instead of being like, what is happening in our classrooms? I don't know. Do you engage? Do you have opportunities to teach faculty about the changes in your students?
Yeah. So I had a great opportunity this last year. I'm part of a committee called Thriving Student Experience. So we're looking at what is the undergraduate experience at George Fox University and where can we tweak some stuff to have a more robust experience for them, but also how do we retain them? What does that look like and stuff? And so one of the pieces that came out was having a yearly faculty conference that we do different pieces. So last year we worked on the first half of the session was talking about the cohort mindset. Like, how do you create cohorts in the classroom? It doesn't have to just be your typical entering freshman, but like it could be a biology group, it could be a
Yeah.
department, it could be your seniors with your freshmen. So looking at what is that cohort. And so we kind of gave the faculty, I explained to them like, what is a cohort? How's it defined? And then they took the first morning and half to create different cohort models that they could do in the academic side and not have to be
Fun.
by student life. And then the afternoon, we broke out into different sessions, and I actually got to teach with a faculty member in our at our institution about the culture of a classroom and like how do you create a culture of a classroom that creates a learning experience that helps students. So we talked about the different, how do you set up the classroom? Does the classroom always have to be in that physical chair space? Does it always have to be the rows and what that looks like? But also in engaging your assignments and what that looks like. So I explained to them, when I do assignments, I don't have full books. I changed it to PDFing different chapters and different stories and articles. And students enjoy that more versus the full book and stuff. And really thinking, am I using that whole book? Should that student have to pay $200 for a book?
Right.
Or am I using like 5 chapters out of it and I could scan it and give it to them a PDF? So really thinking about those first gen students, those students with low SES that can't afford those books. So really thinking about that classroom culture differently. And so it was a really good time about, he was sharing how he gets to know. And I've even heard someone recently say he knew 25 of his students' names within the first 2 days of class. That means a lot to a student. So recognizing those pieces and how to do that. So I've done that with faculty. I've also took a lot of my dissertation and explained to faculty about how do you help kind of change the mentality of that dominant culture in your classroom? How do you recognize the marginalized student in your classroom and help them? And it's not just marginalized by race and ethnicity, but like by ability, by learning experiences. And so how do you shape your dynamics so you're kind of hitting everybody in that area?
Okay, well, I think we can be done for the day because you just said so many helpful things. I'm not even sure. I'm like, oh yeah, and I want to talk about that. So let me, first of all, you talked about structure in a classroom, which I think is so important. You know, in counseling, we have structural counseling where we talk about how you set up your room and where everybody in the family sits and what you can understand about relationships there, right? And that is a great example of that metacognition of like, oh, we just come in and here's the classroom versus, no, you can be thoughtful about that and you can communicate a lot to students around that. I have a great story about when I was getting my degree, I got in trouble and I had to meet with 3 of my faculty members. And I came in and 2 of the faculty members, there was a table, they were sitting across from me, right? So I came in and sat down. And the 3rd faculty member came in and looked at what happened and she came and sat next to me. And it was 20 years ago. And it was so powerful because what she was saying in that is like, Rachel, we're not against you. We're like, I want to sit next to you and join you in this. So just that conversation of structure in a classroom, I think is something faculty often have not thought about at all. So it's a great point. But I also love what you said about PDFs. I was just reading an article about how for faculty, their students have access to a lot of information, and what faculty can become is a curator of that information, right? That you're pulling things from different places and saying, this is really powerful, instead of asking your students to wade through an entire textbook or all of the stuff that exists around it. You're able to say like, these are really powerful things. So were faculty like resistant to that? Or did you feel like they took that in and were like, oh, I could do some of that?
I feel like they were open to it because it's how you kind of present it to them. And like, here's, just challenge yourself to do 2 of them this next year.
Yeah.
Try it out, see how it goes, and like notice the differences. And I gave examples too of like my time at George Fox and some of the faculty who did like move the classroom out to the quad when it was sunny outside, recognizing that like we live in a cloudy area and when the sun comes out, we're all going to skip, or you can take the classroom and move it outside and that has meaning. Or today's assignment is going to be about life skills versus the actual textbook items. And so those key components. And so I think them hearing some of their peers who still work here, here's what they've done, but then also hearing from other peers when we presented it as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think if those things come naturally to you, right? Like if you're constantly thinking about how do I engage students,
Yeah.
it's hard to teach because sometimes you're like, I just do this.
Yeah.
But I think faculty tend to be very hungry for, I think they want to be great teachers, right?
Yeah.
I think they're just hungry for guidance on how to do that really well, especially with their population. Okay, I have another question for you. So you have done a lot of research on this idea of students of color at institutions where the dominant ethnicity is white.
Yep.
And especially Christian institutions. So can you help us understand kind of some of your key findings around that, and what can our institutions implement to address that issue?
Yeah. So I think, like, you use the word dominant. So that's kind of with my dissertation. We always look at predominantly. So that means people that it's predominantly white people that reside at the institution, students, faculty, staff, etc. I focused on dominant because it also looks at the policies and practices that we do. It's not just that we're looking at the individuals, but we're looking at the holistic picture of how the institution is structured, the systems and practices and policies that we have in place. Are they from a dominant lens versus from a more diverse lens and what that looks like? So really looking at those practices. So in hiring student leaders, how are you approaching that subject? One thing that I learned kind of early on in my career was, especially faith-based institutions, we always ask a faith question, a part of the interviewing process. How I talk about my faith as a white person looks very different than how a Black person is going to talk about their faith. And so you're looking for very sugar-coated, cookie cutter type things when it comes to that question versus being a little more open of like, what does it really mean to talk about your faith? What does that look like? So my teams would have those discussions, and I encourage other schools, what does that look like? How are you asking that question? Because you might not get the answer you're wanting because you're looking for a very specific lens and how to view that and being a part of it.
So can I ask you a question about that? Are you saying the way that you're wording the question or the way that you're listening to the response, or some mixture of both?
It's kind of a mixture of both. It can be how you ask it, and then what you're listening for. A lot of times you're listening for very specific, like, key words. Did they use the word Jesus in that? Did they use it this specific way? Versus kind of like, okay, what does it mean to have a spiritual journey? What does that look like for that individual? And so being more diverse and just thinking about that perspective. Also just looking at your hiring promotional materials. How are you going out? So the students I talk to, it's the one-on-one, it's the connecting, those relational pieces. It's not the posters, it's not the social media, it's not all of those extra pieces. But did somebody come and tap and say, here's what I see about you, this is why you should apply for this position, and really encouraging that individual. And it's hard in this digital world. We just think, oh, we just keep throwing all those digital pieces, but you really got to go tap those shoulders. And so faculty and staff, and especially their peers, are going to play a huge part in getting them to that place and what that looks like, and saying, okay, you do have the skills. Here's what I see in you and what I can learn from you as a leader, and being involved in those areas and being a part of it. And
it's
then
so
really,
sorry, I just was going to say about that. I always think about that kind of in terms of lending your vision to the student, right? That it's like, I see this thing and maybe you don't, but I'm going to give that to you so that you can then imagine this path that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. So I think it's so important to be able to do that lending vision.
Yeah.
Okay. You have one more?
Yeah. And then I would just say, like, systems, thinking about, think about an RA, like, what are those policies and processes that we have in place? Thinking about, what does it look like for that individual of color who's going to have to address that issue? Does it make sense to them? Does the policy make sense as a whole community, or is it really driven from one lens and being a part of that? So really reviewing those, because they're the individual who might have to address their friend of color who doesn't get it or doesn't understand why. And then they get this, well, you're just being whitewashed. Like, you're just doing what the white individuals are doing because of this. So really evaluating and assessing those pieces to say, okay, what does this policy really mean? What is the heart of it? And then how do we best articulate it to our
having the language to be able to describe that. Yeah. And it's so interesting because I think at a lot of campuses, there is really, really good intention. There's really, like, people want to have inclusive policies and systems and language, but it's like, if you don't sit in the right perspective, you can't even imagine what the right language or policy would be, right? So you have to have people from all of these different places in life to be able to say, here's how I would interpret that, because you can't guess how somebody who is from a different place or from a different position would interpret it. Yeah, it's good. Okay, so related, this idea of, for so many of our institutions who are Christian institutions, there's this place of racial justice advocacy. So what is our responsibility when we're thinking about faith and we're thinking about racial justice? How do you talk to a campus about that?
For me, it's rooted in my faith and who I am. God calls us to love thy neighbor. Like, that's where we're called throughout biblical verses, throughout the texture and what that looks like and stuff. But even just thinking about like Micah 6:8, a call to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. What does that look like? What does that be a part of? And so having those conversations, like you said, you've got to have a broader lens. So little things, for example, I was at an institution and we were looking at new marketing stuff, and they were like, they want to use the word access as one of their marketing pieces. I said, but is the institution accessible to everybody? If you want to make that your marketing tool, you have to really dig deep. Is it accessible to everybody that you're going to offer it to? If it's not, then I would probably not make that the like thing that's going on the freeway for everybody to see, because you'll be critiqued in that and stuff. So really thinking about your policies, your processes, what does that look like? And that's everything from student stuff to even full-time staff stuff. So, what's your definition of professionalism? Like, we define sometimes professionalism is this very certain dress, your hair has to be a certain way, etc. But does that include everybody? Does that really market that piece? Dreads could be something that is professional to that individual. Who am I to determine that that's not professional and what that looks like? So really having those intentional conversations at looking at those systems, looking at those processes and saying, okay, what lens are they coming from and how do we kind of advocate for a change in thinking through those elements?
Yeah, as you're saying that, it's really interesting because obviously, if you have a faith-based institution, you have this foundation of love and inclusiveness, right? Yes. So we would hope that as you're talking to a faith-based institution, that would come very naturally. Like, we would be very careful about what we say and what we expect and those sorts of things. Yeah. But it butts up against this other piece, which is there is right and wrong. There's what you should do and what you shouldn't do, right? Yeah. And so in some ways, the advantage of having a foundation of love and inclusiveness is sort of, there's this counteractive where we say, but there are things we do expect. You can't do this, you can do this. Yeah. And sometimes that gets infused into places where maybe it doesn't need to be, right? And I think that walking between those two places can be really difficult sometimes. Whereas if you have an institution that's not faith-based, there's not a place where they're like right and wrong, really. They're like, whatever is good for you is good. So I think it makes it a little bit more difficult for our schools to navigate. Okay, related to how do you navigate this, there's a really difficult place on campus where we sit between, somebody in your position sits between things like student care and student concern, and how do we show grace to our students and make sure that they feel unconditional positive regard, right? And all of that kind of stuff. And student conduct and Title IX, which you also have done, which is like, hey, there are things you're allowed to do and things you're not allowed to do. Yeah. And you get in trouble when you do those things. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigate that and just how you show up in a room when a student is in trouble, but you also want for them to feel seen and loved on your campus?
Yeah, I really believe in redemption and trying to restore those moments with students and stuff. if you think about it, they're 18 to 22-year-olds. Their brain is not fully
Right.
developed yet. So they're still learning. It's their first time away from home and kind of that natural freedom. And so how do we take an opportunity to come alongside them and help them learn from that versus just penalize them for that, their action, their behavior, and what that looks like? Obviously, there's certain things that like we won't tolerate, but it's also, how do you educate them in that moment about here's where that line got crossed, and here's why we have to have these consequences or these actions that go with that and stuff. So I always come into a situation with students, and I always tell them that, like, most times there's three sides of the story. I'm getting your story, I'm getting what I've heard from other people, and then there's the truth in between. And my goal is to find out what the truth is, and based on that information, make the most informed decision to not only help you, but help our community and stuff. I think it's also letting them remember that they are a part of community. It's not just themselves that's being impacted by their actions, but it's other members of our community that are being impacted. So helping them recognize and process. Does it always work? Does it always go the way I hope it to? No, it doesn't. You're working with 18 and 22-year-olds, and sometimes they have to go through a lot more bumps than just one or two to kind of really learn the lesson and be a part of that. But our hope is always to have that restorative practice. How do I get you to see what's happening, what's occurring? And really what I always am trying to look for is, what is the root cause? It's never usually the incident that occurred. There's something deeper going on. Family issues, academic issues, mental health issues. There's always something else happening with those students. And so how do I get to that thing and address that issue? Because if we don't address that issue, it's never going to happen and stuff. For example, I had a student that I was working with that came from a lot of probably abuse at home, had parents incarcerated, was struggling academically, probably was not really prepared for college and stuff. And we went around and around and did everything to help that student. And I finally had to have a very honest conversation with them to say, you choose to keep jumping on this roller coaster. You have to ultimately be the person to decide that you're going to jump off. All of us can give you tools and tips and tricks and all of these things, but until you decide what you want to do, this pattern is just going to keep happening and be a part of it. So like really think, what do you want ultimately in the end? And then let's aim towards that versus keep going up and down in these roller coaster moments with you.
Yeah. And that's such a good example of respect for the student too, which I feel like a lot of times, because people, especially in student development, want to create a path to success for a student, that we sometimes can take on the responsibility of like, and I'm going to make this student right. And I'm going to, but the truth is you cannot, and you have to say you have autonomy, and I respect that autonomy, and I'm going to show you the path, but I can't force you down it, because if I do, the result's going to be the same because you didn't pick it. Right. So I think saying to a student, you're allowed to fail. You're allowed to make that choice. You're allowed to make choices that I think are bad choices because you're in charge of you, I think can be really, really difficult. What you just said, the application of student development, it's one of the reasons why I love that language so much, because if you think about your students from 18 to 21 and the way they develop as people, that it is this like guide. We always talk about, I want to be a guide to students and walk alongside them and give them wisdom and give them suggestions and all of those things, because I think a huge part of why students love college and parents love college is because they get to be in a different kind of community that is really helping them develop as a person, right? And community member. Right? I just love that language so much. It's such a privilege to be able to walk alongside. I also, so related, I want to ask you about a community member, because this is a thing that I think, as you're talking about how students are changing, I think there really is a gap in how students understand how to be in community, because so much of their engagement is online and not in person, and can be self-centered, like how I experience this, what I'm doing. Have you found that to be a skill that you're having to teach more and more often, how we are a good community member?
Yeah, I would say there's probably more of it And it just depends on the student too. Like it depends on the group. Like we have groups of students who are great at it, and then there's other students that we've got to work through what that looks like. So, um, you know, the word I love and hate at the same time is when a student says, "I feel unsafe." What it usually boils down to is you're uncomfortable. Not that you're unsafe, but you're uncomfortable because you're having experiences that you've never had before. What does that look like? How do you interact with a roommate? How do you interact with a friend? And so really helping them navigate language around what's actually occurring and what's happening. And so really helping students. So those intentional one-on-one times, I always tell students the reason my door is open is because I want you to come in. I want you to feel like you can come in at any point. And when my door is open, that means that's a signal to interact and hang out in my office. So you know you have a safe space and being a part of that and being involved. But really having to do the one-on-one times, like connecting with them, saying hello to them, and really being a part of that. That means we have to be intentional too, because we've also got sucked into the social media. So when you're walking across campus, are you on your phone or are you actually like seeing students and having conversations with them? Or when they've told you something about a test or a final or those things coming up, do you follow back up with them to see? Like you have to be the example of what you're trying to teach them to be. And if you're not doing that, then they're like, well, what's the point?
How would I know? Yeah.
So something that like we do in our office is we all go to lunch almost consistently at 11:30 every day. And we all go as a full team. So students see us in community, in the dining hall, joining together. That's something that we talk about and emphasize the importance of with our students, but we're also examples of that. You will consistently, like we walk out of our rec center, say hello to all those students, then make our way over to the dining hall and interact with staff there that are involved and then interact with students as well.
That's such a good example. It's funny, Matt and I were just talking about that with intentionality is like there's the having lunch, right? But the one level above that is together in the cafeteria in a predictable time where students can see us. All of those things that's actually the message. That's actually what we're trying to teach you, right? It's really interesting the language that you're talking about with uncomfortable and unsafe. And it's almost like we have to give students this, Brene Brown talks about permission slips, which is like you write to yourself, like, I have permission to have hard conversations. I have permission to feel uncomfortable and still play, right? Those kinds of just teaching for a student that sometimes it is hard and sometimes it is uncomfortable and you can be safe and uncomfortable at the same time. That's kind of how we show up for each other sometimes. So I love that language. Okay, let's see. So you have talked a little bit about this idea of concierge mentality, which I think is did you coin that phrase?
No, but it's something we've talked about.
I think it's very relevant for our discussion.
Yeah. So it's something a lot of like parents especially, but also students are getting to this where they almost want a concierge type mentality. So we want the spa treatments, we want the special attention, the valet parking, the things that we all expect when we go on a vacation, but at the college level. And that really one-on-one individual treatment and expectation. And there's also that if you don't meet that expectation, then you're not knowing the student and not caring about them and being involved. So it's really having some real intentional conversations with families and students about what can we as an institution realistically provide you during your time here, and then what also is kind of your responsibility when it comes to being a student or a family member, a part of our community, what that involves in. And so I had a colleague who used to kind of explain it with students when it came to engagement. It's like a marriage proposal in marriage. There's two sides. It takes two people. So we as an institution can offer so many things, but you as a student or family have to then pick up the other side and participate in that relationship. It can't be a one side that it's just the institution's responsibility to do these things, but it's also you as an individual, as a community, as a family being involved and stuff. So, and there's just, I think even the government thinks that there's all these things that we're capable of doing. Title IX is a great example of that. Here, do this thing, but we're going to give you absolutely no money towards it. We're going to give you barely any information or training on how to do it. And then we're supposed to like run a judicial system that we're not even trained in and be a part of. Like I joke as a student affairs professionals, I swear that I have to have a degree in almost everything from design to engineering, medical degree. I'm like, I didn't know I needed to get like degrees to go in this field, but that's what people expect, is that you're going to do these very specific tasks to meet my specific need. And it's every individual. It's not just like an over-encompassing. It's like my student, my experience. So it's like, how do we navigate those waters as it becomes increasingly more, because we're in that instant gratification with everything that we do. So that's going to increase for all of us. So how do we set clear expectations for everybody involved in that process?
Yeah, because what you're really talking about is what we promise students and what we promise families, and setting realistic expectations. And it's funny because there's sort of two sides of this. I mean, I know a lot of schools who promote a concierge model, right? Who say like, we will do your laundry and you can get your hair cut here and we're going to do all of this kind of stuff, and promote that idea, which is that's incredibly difficult to deliver on, right? Like you come with that expectation, all of a sudden we've taken our eye off of the student development piece and academic piece, and we've become a really nice hotel for students. So part of that is how you're promising what you're promising.
Exactly.
But you know, there's this other piece that I've often thought would be really successful, which is where you say to parents and students and families, listen, we are not a 5-star hotel. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. We're going to help you be uncomfortable. We're going to help you become part of a community. We're going to sharpen you. We're going to develop you, but we actually are no frills. We're actually not doing frills. This is going to be hard, right? And I think you would attract a different kind of student. I think there are families and students to which that would be incredibly attractive. And it fits more in the like teaching how to be an adult, which I think a lot of students are really, really hungry for.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I tell people always say to me, like, you know, sometimes you come across a little more harsh than the rest of us, but students like love you. And I said, it's because I'm authentic with them. They know where I stand on everything. They know that there's no sugarcoating when it comes to a situation. And I think they crave that, is like, they've always had these moments where everybody's kind of putting fluff around it and being a part of it, but like, they know exactly where I stand and that they'll get the utter truth when they talk to me. And I think that's something that they enjoy and that they're kind of craving from the adults around them in their life.
Yeah. So you talk about this idea of relational capital. And I think it's really, really hard where we have all this sort of digital understanding of each other and all that. Can you just, as my last question to you, help us understand what that means, relational capital?
Yeah. So, well, relational is like through and through for me. So it's important to me. Like I said, one is lunch. So when I first started working here, but even in my other institutions, setting aside time and saying lunch is not a meeting time. It's a time to go interact and create that community and being a part of that. Also making sure that you're varying your relationships. So I don't only interact with student life. I try to interact with faculty, vice presidents. I try to be intentional about setting coffee dates to go interact with those individuals, get to know about their area. And then that helps get rid of some of that silo pieces that we happen within higher ed, and making sure, and then really being intentional about those interactions with students. So like, I don't have student activities, all those things in my area of expertise. It's not even in my current role, but I'm intentional about, I go and chaperone 3 dances a year. Do I have to do that? No, but students see me, those students, leaders see that I'm willing to like come into their space and be a part of those activities and stuff. So I try to make sure that I try to hit different events and being involved. And so that shows them like, I care about who they are as a student, and I'm willing to show up to that event. If a student asks me to come to something, I'm going to set aside the time to do that and be a part of it, because that relationship is important to me as an individual and what I do in my job and being a part of it. So it's really important. Like, how do you infuse those, especially as you get in these dean roles, VP roles? How do you infuse? So I had a vice president say one time, he always made sure on his calendar that there were students, like he had everything color coded. And so say students were purple. If he didn't see purple on his calendar for the week, he would tell his admin, like, that has to change. You need to rearrange other people. And I think that impacted me early on in my career. Like, I have to set aside time. So we have space out here where students hang out. I'm going to walk out of my office and work on my computer out there with them for a couple hours. And to them, that's a huge deal. Like, I might not be doing their activity, but I'm at least physically with them, and they know that, like, hey, this person kind of cares and what that looks like and being involved.
It's such a great, I mean, first of all, modeling how we live in community, right? Yeah. It's a really important modeling piece. But I think just that language, teaching students the language of relational capital and saying, here are all of the ways that I build that into my schedule so that I'm, I mean, if you think about it in terms of a bank, right? I'm banking all of this relational time so that you understand that's important to me, and I'm really investing in it. I think, I just think about these students who I was one of these students, and this is before I had an iPhone, right? But I was one of these students where I did spend a lot of time by myself. I was isolated on my campus. And if someone had said, Rachel, how are you building up relational capital in your college career? I would have been like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm not doing that. Right. And if somebody had said that's something you should be investing in, it really would have changed the way that I approached. It's not so much about what I want, but actually that I'm building this thing that's going to be important in the long run. So I think it's such great language for them to understand in that student development space. I really love it. All right. Well, as always, we've run out of time, and I've got 18 more questions I'm going to ask you.
We can do round 2.
Yeah, for sure. It's so nice to be able to talk to somebody who has been in this space for so long and seen this evolution. And, Matt and I really respect the way that you do your job and show up for your students and are really intentional about that, right? That it's not like you're just stumbling through this, like, yeah, we've got students, whatever, but really being thoughtful about that. And so I think this conversation to challenge our listeners to say, how can I not think about just lunch, but how do I do lunch well, right? And how do I do office hours well? And how do I do student conduct in Title IX well? I think it's a good challenge for us to think through. So thank you so much for joining me today. And we really will. Like I said, I really do have 7 more questions for you. So we'll have to have you on again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys for joining us. Have a great day.